Now, President Trump has announced new tariffs of between 10 and 12% on dozens of countries, including the UK, over concerns that they're not doing enough to tackle forced labour. The UK government has responded, saying that it is tackling the issue of forced labour and that it will continue to engage regularly with the United States. The EU has said the tariffs are unjustified. Let's talk to Harry Broadman. He's a former US Assistant Trade Representative and Chief of Staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisers under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Good evening to you, Harry.
Hi, Kara. How are you?
I'm very well. Delighted to have you with us. Just talk us through these new tariffs that have been announced by the President today.
Well, they arise because the law that he had chosen, I think most of us who were trade negotiators knew was not the correct law. And so that was overturned by the Supreme Court. And so he's been on a hunt to try to figure out, he clearly wants to put tariffs on willy-nilly. And so he's now brought out, several other laws. Frankly, they do apply to the kinds of things generally that we trade negotiators use to impose penalties on countries. But the problem is, as the soundbite in the beginning said, they're talking now about forced labor in countries where I think that's probably a de minimis problem. But it shows that under Mr. Trump, tariffs are becoming an arm of political economy rather than trade. And he just likes to use it wherever he can. And that is a very uncomfortable thought, that the President of the United States is changing, in essence, what the use of tariffs is supposed to be for. And I think the most important issue, to be honest with you, is the uncertainty, once again, that Mr. Trump has engendered into the U.S. economy and, frankly, the global economy.
Yeah, because we had a whole series of sweeping tariffs. Some of those have been rolled back. But are you saying that many of them have now actually had to be removed altogether because of that court ruling?
It's a complicated process. So, generally, yes, they've been deemed illegal, and the issue, particularly in the United States, is how to get rebates back to the people who have paid the tariffs, whether it's the firms or the customers who have paid the firms for the imported goods. And that is a complete mess, honestly. And I think that is engendering costs on the United States. And then, as I said earlier, the other costs are external to the United States. The U.S. used to be the champion of rules-based trade. We no longer are that champion, and I think that is deeply troubling. It would be one thing if there was a rule and everybody could adjust, but depending on what he had for breakfast or dinner, Mr. Trump is choosing a different rationale for tariffs, and I've never seen anything, and I don't think anybody else has anything quite like this.
Well, given that we've had that Supreme Court ruling saying that many of those so-called Liberation Day tariffs were not justified and not legal, I mean, are the courts actually going to consider that imposing tariffs because of what they say is an issue with forced labour in countries including the UK, is that going to be any more legitimate in the court's eyes?
I think there's a better chance of it, because this is a substantive set of claims. Whether they're true or not is another matter. But I think now at least Mr. Trump is dealing in substance. I think in many cases the substance is false, but at least has an economic rationale rather than an economic emergency rationale, which was the original law. And the laws that he is using, they're very sound laws. There are reasons when you should use them and reasons you should not. But at least now he's got the right book open. Now, whether or not these tariffs stick, whether or not there's retaliation, we're not out of the soup at all. But I think the point was, initially, we went down a road that should not have gone down at all. Now we're going down a different road. There can be legitimate reasons for tariffs, but I think the reasons that he is articulating in many cases are ephemeral.
It's interesting that on this long list of countries that could face these new tariffs are China, where, I mean, there does seem to be quite significant evidence of forced labour used in some of its processes. But of course, when the US imposed sweeping tariffs on China in the past, China simply retaliated to such a degree that the US had to back down. Presumably, there's a risk of a repeat of that situation.
No, absolutely. I think the law to which you're referring to has to do with forced labor among Uyghurs in the western part of China, particularly in growing and processing cotton. And that is a very specific law, precisely for that particular problem. But I think the laws that Mr. Trump is now appealing to, Section 301 and 232, I'm sure your listeners don't want to get into these names, but there are rationales for them that can be, credible. Very different, I think, from the original law, this IEEPA law, which was not a credible basis. So now he's going to have to bear the burden of proof to show why the statutory authority that he's using actually has a logic behind it. So he's now on the defensive, I think. But as I say, we can watch these arguments back and forth. But here we have the world's largest economy, who has been the champion of rules-based trade and investment for decades. We now have a head of state who is throwing that all down the trash bin. And I think that kind of uncertainty, that lack of rules-based economic stewardship on the part of the United States and by the President of the United States, I think is really quite corrosive, more corrosive than I think than looking at the headlines.
What do you think, is it possible to quantify the effect that President Trump's tariffs, and as we've been hearing, some of them have been on and off and on again, is it possible to say how much of an effect that has had on the US economy? President Trump, of course, talked about his love of tariffs. His whole idea was that it would force companies to base their production and so on in the United States. Has it worked?
Well, I think that is a play in motion. There are ways, as we economists do, we can calculate, on the margin, what are the costs that are engendered by certain actions. It's a difficult calculation because you've got to rule out other kinds of factors that are otherwise giving rise to costs. You really want to narrow it down to say these costs are directly as a result of the tariffs being placed. So these are exercises that one can do. I don't think we're at that point yet, because I think the cost that you and I are talking about in the first instance is the uncertainty in the notion that he said, okay, well, that law wasn't the right one. Now I'm going to choose these, and I'm going to go after the UK for forced labor. I'm going to go after Countrywide for another reason. And it's like a kid in a candy shop. He's just picking out different candies to see which one will be sweetest. And that's not a way to practice trade policy, let alone run the world's largest economy.
Yeah, I mean, you've already got threats, warnings from countries, including Canada, that they are prepared to retaliate. The EU has said it's committed to the trade deal and considers tariffs imposed on these grounds to be unjustified. I mean, it does risk, doesn't it, annoying many of its important trading partners. Just very briefly, if you could.
Yes, no, it does risk that, but I think the annoyance is one thing. The real risk is the cost of slowing growth in the global economy by dint of the fact of how Mr. Trump is practicing trade policy here, and that's the cost that's most corrosive. And it's very difficult to put your finger on it and how you measure it, and it's going to take time to work its way through the system. That is the number one problem, I think, that we have to think about.
Harry Broadman, former US Assistant Trade Representative. Really great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol.